Hello, Wisdom Seeker, and welcome back to another episode of Gathering Wisdom. Has the rising cost of groceries got you down lately? And I'm not just talking about the $12 eggs at the grocery store. I'm talking about just the overall cost of food and generally what it takes to support life. I started looking at our budgets this week and I noticed that to feed a family of two and a half, two adults and a baby, costs about the same as what it takes to feed all of the animals under our purview. That includes two horses, four goats, chickens, two dogs, two cats. And that's everybody eating, not super fancy, but high quality food. And we don't eat out typically as a family. Maybe a couple times a month we get some takeout, maybe order a pizza or get a burger. But for the most part, we eat very simple and we try to eat healthy and clean. And that's with supplements from my garden. So this winter, I was able to grow a full winter crop with some broccoli and greens, lots of chard, the easy to grow stuff, lettuce, kale, etc. It's been a huge topic of conversation between me and my friend circle about just the rising cost of groceries and what are we going to do? The last time we had to cut back on the grocery bill, I remember adopting what I call the 80-20 rule, primarily plant based with 20% animal products. I am not going to claim to be a vegan or a vegetarian. Nothing's ever going to separate me from my backyard chicken eggs. But I started looking in my pantry and I started assessing which pantry items could pull double, triple duty and give me the biggest bang for my buck. And I followed my culinary curiosity this week down a rabbit hole into the magic of this one I feel overlooked pantry staple that should be the pillar of almost any zero waste kitchen. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, the soybean. Let's get into it. I can't believe that I've been on the zero waste journey for almost 10 years, and it never occurred to me to make my own soy products, milk, tofu. I just think in my head, I felt like there was a really high barrier to entry to making tofu. It was some mystical process, and I needed all this equipment. And I just never really did my due diligence or research to see how simple it was. So, the first thing I did this week was evaluate where in our grocery list we should cut back. And I will say we drink a lot of milk. And I think what happened was we got a little carried away with the dairy because I don't know, for some reason, just postpartum, I was craving just a lot of milk. I also started making our own yogurt and I drink kefir. So to keep the kefir greens alive, you got to feed it milk pretty much every day. And we do not buy cheap milk. We buy to keep it zero waste and low waste, we buy the glass milk with the cream on top from Strauss, organic, comes from Petaluma, which is, if you, only a couple hundred miles away, high quality milk. And it adds up because every time you're buying the milk in the glass, you're also paying for a deposit, even though you return the jugs. So it just adds up because it ends up being like $6.99 or $7.99 for a half gallon, which that's a lot of money. And we're usually buying couple gallons a week. So you can imagine. One of the ways you can cut back is just to make your own milks, your own plant-based milk. And that includes soy milk. I've made hemp milk in the past. You can also make rice milk. All these milks are easy. Of course, almond milk is the famous one, but almonds are also equally expensive. But when you learn how to make the soy milk, the process is pretty much the same for making tofu. You just have to do a couple of extra steps. It's not as easy, of course, as just buying it off the shelf at the grocery store, but there's a lot of advantages to making your own soy milk because they do add a lot of ingredients to soy milk. Those soy milk cartons are generally not recyclable. They're plastic lined. And when you make your own tofu, you're also eliminating all of the plastic waste associated with that. So, sure enough, I took a look at the bulk section of my grocery store because it never occurred to me that there were soybeans available in bulk. I had never thought to look. And sure enough, there they were. I brought home 3 pounds in my own container, of course. It was $2.49 a pound. So I spent a little under $8 for this giant jar of soybeans, which I knew was going to last me a long time because when I looked up the process, it said that to make soy milk or tofu, you're dealing with pretty much a cup of beans at a time. So I figured, okay, this is going to last me a minute. And I think now it just makes sense to kind of walk you through the basics of the process of making the milk. So, what you're going to do first is, of course, rinse your beans and soak them overnight. Make sure that you put them in a vessel where they can double to triple their size with a little bit of water on top. The next morning, when you go look at your beans, you're going to see some bubbling maybe at the top, and that's just the beans giving off some extra protein. And you're going to see maybe some of the soybean skins. Some people leave the skins on. You can also just do a quick like scrub, like rub them together with your fingers in a colander and strain them and get rid of those little, they're like these little paper thin filament-y type skins that come off of the beans. I left them on and blended them as is. I just figured extra fiber because it didn't really give off any different of a taste. So when you put them in the blender, I think a good rule of thumb is a 1-to-4 ratio. So 1 cup of beans to 4 cups of water. Make sure that your blender can hold that much because it will get really frothy. You may have to do it in batches. The other thing you need is a big stock pot, like 6-quart stock pot. The bigger the better. A fine mesh strainer or cheesecloth or a nut milk bag. And I think that's pretty much it. And a whisk. So get all of your supplies together, blend up your soybeans. You're going to filter the milk through a mesh strainer or your nut milk bag and put it in, strain it straight into the pot. And in order to get rid of the beanie taste and make it taste a little bit more neutral, you've got to boil off the protein in the bean. So bring that liquid that you just strained into your pot to a boil. And some people cook it for a few minutes. I cooked it for about 10 to 15 minutes. The longer you cook it, the more like of a roasted flavor you're going to get and the less beany it's going to taste, the less fresh. Make sure you're stirring it constantly because it will stick to the bottom of the pan and you want to make sure that you're not going to scorch it. At this point, it acts very similar to cow milk, to leche, and it will even start to form, like if you let it boil, you're bringing it to a boil, it might even start to form a little film on top. That stuff is called yuba. You can either scrape it off and eat it. That's what I did. Stuck my finger in there because I like to do that when I'm bringing milk to a slow boil. It also gets that film on top and I think it's just delicious. It's just protein that's building up. You can stir it back in and reconstitute it, or some people actually remove those little, that film and they use it as a substitute in some Asian soups like egg drop soup, which I found was really interesting. They'd also use it in desserts and I haven't wandered down that rabbit hole yet, but it's a good plant-based substitute in place of egg yolk. So, like I said, cook it. The longer you cook it, the less fresh it'll taste, the more roasted it'll taste. And then you can opt to strain it again. Some people prefer to just drink it warm right when they take it off the stove. Or, of course, you can pour it into an airtight container and it'll stay good in the fridge for a couple of days. You're going to want to drink it well within the week though. Like I wouldn't let it get to day 4 or 5. It doesn't have any preservatives in it. That's the whole point of making it fresh. It's so simple to do. So just make sure you're drinking it up within a couple of days. I learned that you can freeze it. It freezes really well. So what I do is I'll make a double batch and then I'll freeze it. And then that way it saves me some time during the week so that I don't have to make another batch and then I'll just continue to I'm all about batch cooking these days because I'm just low on time, so I'm already in the kitchen. So it was good to know that it freezes really well. Okay, so now for making tofu, it's a little bit more involved, but it's not hard. Once you bring your soy milk to a boil, instead of straining it off and sticking it in the fridge to drink, instead of straining it off again for the second time and then sticking it in the fridge, add some lemon juice. And then you're going to remove it from the heat and you're going to let it sit. And what the lemon juice is going to do, very similar to making ricotta, it's going to create curds. So it'll start to curdle and you don't necessarily have to use lemon juice. I did some research on some other acids, if you will, that you can use in tofu making. The traditional method, they use nagari, and I was not able to source that locally. So I just used lemon. Some people use white vinegar. There's a couple of other ingredients you can use. I even read you could use citric acid. So I have not experimented. Lemon did a good enough job, although I will say my curdles were very, very tiny. So same thing like making ricotta. There's different substances you can use to make your ricotta and it'll give you bigger curdles. And if that's like a consistency that you're going for, I'm just going to assume if you're concerned about the size of your curdles, that you're on a different culinary level altogether and that you're going to pretty much figure it out. But this is just for basic beginner tofu making 101. Once the soy milk has curdled, you'll see the liquid separate. And at that point, you're going to strain off the excess liquid and reserve a cup or two because that's what you're going to help preserve your tofu in. You know, tofu always comes in like a little bit of a water bath. So just strain off most of it, but reserve a couple of cups of liquid so that you can store your tofu and keep it fresh. And from there, strain it into a cheesecloth. All the curds go into a cheesecloth, and you can press out most of the liquid, but not all of it. And then you can kind of shape it into a loaf. At this point, some people opt to get a little tofu mold. I just used a small glass Tupperware container and I pressed it down a little bit more. And to my surprise, formed a little bit of a block. So I put a little bit of the whey or the reserved liquid to keep it from drying out, and bing, bang, boom, there's your tofu. I'll have a full step by step guide on how to do this on my Substack, and I'll link to my Substack below because that's slowly moving away from Instagram. And I feel like Substack is a community where all of these creators who are fleeing the meta are joining up and joining forces and creating a nice little community there. So now you've got your tofu, it's kicking it in the fridge until you're ready to use it. And then you've got a bunch of with this pulpy substance called okara. And I just want to give you some tips on how you can use that stuff because, like all parts of the buffalo and all parts of the fish, we want to make sure we're not wasting anything. That pulp is really valuable. People put it into stir fries and it gives it a nice nutty flavor. They also put it in soups and stews to thicken it up. I read that a lot of people save them in these silicone ice cube trays, which is what I did, and they pop them in their freezer from later. And you can add it to egg dishes. You can do a lot of things with it. I made some flatbread out of it. There's a lot of recipes that you can look at online. I can also give you some suggestions in that Substack. But I thought that was pretty cool. Even if I wasn't going to use it for another dish for myself, it would make a fantastic treat for my chickens. So that's something to consider as well. Nothing goes to waste when you're using soybeans. You can make multiple things. And that's kind of what I was getting at in the first place when I was evaluating where's the biggest bang for my buck. I really like versatile ingredients like this that can transform into a bunch of different things and add a lot of nutrients and volume to whatever dishes I'm cooking up. Because that's the whole point, is to get the most for our money. Okay, I want to address the elephant in the room. It's not lost on me that soy has somehow gotten a bad rap. There's a reason I haven't touched it for myself, even though I'm pretty experimental in the kitchen and I'm willing to try a lot of things. I even raised my own mealworms for consumption. So that will definitely be a topic on this podcast at some point. But yes, I was making mealworm dishes. It's not as gross as it sounds, I promise. And I can't wait to dive into that further with you. And I can't wait to actually get some mealworms going again because this is a side note, but I do personally think that we should get comfortable with eating bugs as a really high and efficient source of protein. And the more you can acclimate to the idea of eating bugs and starting simple with raising them yourself because it was just considered less dirty to me. Less the ick factor was somewhat removed because I knew what I was feeding them and I had control over the process and they felt clean to me. So, anyway, that's an aside. But the more we can get comfortable with the weird stuff that other cultures have incorporated for their nutritional benefit, I think the better off we'll be. We just have to start rethinking our food because we know there's no arguing that there's a lot of issues with our industrial food system, which is what led me down the plant-based and the bug-based journey over the past few years. So somehow soy has gotten a bad rap. And I was listening to a podcast. If you haven't checked out this podcast already, I'm just going to do a little plug for it. Mayim Bayalik, she played Blossom on the 90s TV show, and she was in Big Bang Theory and the recent host of Jeopardy! And what I really appreciate about her podcast is she has a co-host who is kind of her opposite. He's like a little bit higher frequency. He oscillates a little bit higher than she does, and he's a little more open to energetic healing, and his life experience has just lent him this perspective that she doesn't have. She, along with being an actress, is also a neuroscientist, studied at UCLA, and she happens to be really well connected and knows a lot of people. So she ends up having a lot of really amazing, thought provoking conversations on her podcast, a lot of spiritual leaders. And it's really interesting to see how her podcast has evolved from interviewing celebrities to interviewing these, I would say, these people who discuss more woo woo topics like near death experiences and auras. So it's very interesting to me to hear her skepticism start to dissolve because of her life experience coming from this very like left brain neuroscientist background. She needs evidence to understand the world around her, and then to have her co-host kind of have this more open perspective on what's possible within these more spiritual topics. So besides the point, check out that podcast, Mayim Bayalik's Breakdown. It's where I get a lot of my inspiration for the topics I want to just discuss here. And I end up going on really deep dives into the people that she ends up bringing on. So she interviewed this doctor, Dr. Andrew Weil. He's been around for a long time. He's a little bit controversial, so just, kind of take it with a grain of salt what he has to say when it comes to certain things, but he is a holistic physician who specializes in an anti-inflammatory diet. And this is what he had to say about unprocessed soy and the benefits and basically why it gets a bad rap. He blames three main factors. The first is xenophobia. I don't know if I necessarily agree with him on this one, but I can see what argument he's trying to make. We're afraid of anything new, generally speaking, in the West. And even though it's been a staple of Eastern diets for centuries, it's made its way over to the West, and people are not as easily ready to adopt it as they are, meat and dairy, because that is our tradition. The other thing is it is a threat to the meat and dairy industry. Soy is a large monocrop around the world just to feed livestock to support the meat and dairy industry. And the fact that soy on its own is generally considered an environmentally friendly crop because it's a legume and it's a nitrogen fixer. It's generally considered low impact to the environment, and and of in and of itself is a great substitute for meat and dairy. And so there's been a lot of language around this idea that soy contains these isoflavones that have estrogen like effects in the body. And at some point, there was a not very verifiable study that showed that it could increase the rate of hormonal cancers, or it could have a feminizing effect on testosterone. None of that's proven to be true. In fact, the opposite. The cultures who do have soy as a main staple of their diet, they actually have a less incidence rate of hormonal cancers. Like Japanese men experience a lower rate of prostate cancer, and there's less incidences of breast cancer in Japanese women. So there's just overwhelming evidence that it's actually protective against hormonally driven cancers. And I will say, just as a note on plant-based diets. This is interesting. There's a show on Netflix called You Are What You Eat, and it followed several sets of twins, and they put one twin on a plant-based diet and one twin on an omnivore diet. And they put them through an exercise regimen. They took a bunch of scans, like they measured with this really fancy machine their visceral body fat. So that's the fat surrounding all of your major internal organs. Obviously, you don't want a lot of visceral fat because it's fat that's very difficult to get rid of. And it's associated with high cholesterol and all of these things that are indicators of, aging and not so great health. The twins that ate a primarily plant-based diet were able to actually grow their telomeres. Telomeres are these, think of it like the end caps on your shoelaces that kind of tie your DNA together. And it's associated with longevity. As you age, those telomeres tend to shorten and fray. And so the fact that these twins were able to reverse and almost correct and lengthen their telomeres spoke a lot about the diet that they were on. And so there's a lot of evidence to suggest that eating primarily plant based is associated with anti inflammation and longevity. And the same is true when we look at cultures around the world who are located in these blue zones. The blue zones are where we have the highest concentration of centenarians living. There's a lot of different factors that go into that, including their community, their lifestyle, their activity level, their, general satisfaction with life. But a big part, of course, with longevity is what you eat and their diet. We all know about the Mediterranean diet, but then there's also a high concentration of centenarians living in Okinawa. And same thing, they're eating these starchy, primarily plant based foods that are keeping them younger. I also just want to note that eating primarily plant based is also just in general better for the planet. When you focus your efforts on eliminating the packaging, you're just going to find that your only option really is to eat primarily plant based because everything else is processed or it comes in packaging. So you're avoiding foods that you shouldn't be eating anyway, because what you should focus on at the end of the day is more plants and think about how many steps did it take to get from where it came from to my table. When I started to reframe how I shopped, was I met with some challenges? Yeah. But I've learned creative substitutions and I've also learned how to kind of do without. I think we've learned over the past few years that as delicious as cheese is, it's highly addictive. But when you stick to making your own cheese at home, like ricotta, I have no problem making my own ricotta, sticking it in a lasagna dish or, gosh, just a big lump of ricotta over some spaghetti. There's nothing wrong with that. It's fresher and it's less processed than a giant block of, let's say, cheddar or American cheese. So I just wanted to rave about soybeans. I don't know anyone else who's ever tried making tofu before. Like I said, I'm not saying I'm the first one. Tofu's been around for a long time. But I want to encourage you to have fun with it, to try it, and then please let me know how it went. I would love to hear from you. Did you enjoy making it? Was it pain in the butt? Is it something that you're likely to try again? Or are you excited to start a plant based journey? And this might be the, fun product or fun process that ends up helping you kick it off. Thank you again, as always, for listening. If you know someone who might find this topic interesting, I encourage you to share it with them. Another listener that I can help out on their journey, wherever they're at, is always a win for me. And until next time, wisdom seekers, stay curious.